Welcome to The Wilderness and the Well. I'm Cece Henderson, your host and the founder of the Sanctuary International. This is the space where we have honest conversations about spiritual formation, purpose alignment. Before we dive into your personal story, let's set the foundation. What are we talking about when we're talking about the pioneer wilderness?
Well, for me, the pioneer wilderness for me symbolizes um, the unknown, right?
Mm,
God calling you into something um, that, like we've talked about, that we've never done before, something that feels very new for you, or maybe even something that the world hasn't seen before. Um, so being the first
mm,
to pioneer to do something different.
yeah, I totally agree. I think it is that stepping into the unknown, stepping into that wilderness, but doing it by choice, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
often we have wildernesses that we kind of find ourselves in, not planning to be there.
Mm-hmm.
But there's something about this pioneer wilderness where you're going to do something new and you're actually choosing to go, maybe willingly or unwillingly,
Mm-hmm.
into this space.
Yeah.
And we see some examples of that in the Bible. The first one that
Mm-hmm.
comes to mind, or the main one that comes to mind for me, is Abraham, who was
Mm-hmm.
Abram at the time. Um, and just this thought, he says, God says, pack up everything
Oh
and
yeah.
go.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. Like the Bible makes it sound really, it says, so he packed up and he went. And I'm thinking, sometimes the Bible doesn't tell us the gaps in between, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where God says, go. And then it just says he went. But there's got to have been some stuff that happened in between. How do you
Mm-hmm.
convince your wife and all of the people, all of your servants, that we're just
Mm-hmm.
going to pack up everything? I know if I was the wife, I'd be like, what's the plan?
I
You're not
know.
even telling me where you're going.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so this
I,
idea, go ahead.
no, I was gonna say I thought about Moses as well, but I think he walked into something that
Mm,
he didn't really realize that he was entering,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And ended up in this wilderness for 40 years, which eventually like led him to his calling, so to speak.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's interesting because both of those examples, there's definitely that element of not really knowing what you're stepping into, from
Mm-hmm.
the version where you just have no idea where you're going.
Mm-hmm.
Moses had this basic understanding of, I've come to deliver the people of Israel, but really having no clue of what that looks like. And
Right.
that's one of the interesting thing about the pioneer wilderness. We can be willing to step into it, and we just have no clue
Right.
about what we're getting ourselves into.
Yeah, and even I mean he had no idea going into the wilderness initially
Mm.
that that would be the result.
Yeah.
Because he went into the wilderness, encountered God, then did his assignment, then walked into another wilderness.
Mm.
You know? Wow.
Yeah, that's something to discuss in another episode,
Mm-hmm.
but these wildernesses keep coming, right? Because you think I've
Mm-hmm.
gone through one, surely that's it. I've done my
Mm-hmm.
share. But imagine it going into the wilderness to then be prepared for the next wilderness. Yeah.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
okay. So we've kind of talked about what the pioneer wilderness is and what our understanding is, and but I want you to take us back then to a moment when you first felt like God was nudging you forward into something new. Like what was going on in your life at the time?
Yeah, so the very first time that I can think of actually going into wilderness, and I often liken my experience as the Abrahamic walk. Um, I remember I was, you know, in New York and I wanted to move. I didn't know where I wanted to move to, but I knew I had to move. It was time. I was probably around maybe my early 30s. And I was like, you know what? I think it's time for me to see what it's like to be on my own. And I had no idea where I was going to go, but I kept praying about it, praying about it. And eventually, the Lord showed me through a dream that He wanted me to go to North Carolina.
Mm,
And um, I was petrified because this was my first time actually being on my own without my parents. You
yeah.
know, I'm going to a new state, didn't really have anybody in that state. I How he confirmed to me in this dream was he used someone that I knew moved down south, but I didn't know where down south they moved to.
Mm,
And so when I got up in the morning, I said, if this person lives in North Carolina, because he had been speaking to me about North Carolina, then I know that this is God. And so when I got up from the dream, I looked on her Facebook account. She lived in Charlotte, North Carolina. So that for me sealed the deal. And yeah, I had no, other than her, I knew nobody. I knew nothing about the place. Um, and I think I was a bit scared at first. And so I did like one of those spying out the land. So
yeah.
the year before I even had this dream, a year before, I visited just to see and get a feel for it, and I didn't like it. Yeah. Um, because I ended up booking a very cheap hotel, which ended up being a motel. My first night in a motel, place smelling crazy.
Mm,
And I was just like, this cannot be it. This cannot be it. But eventually I had the dream, and that was like the confirmation. So yeah, I was moving to a new state. Um,
mm,
Moving to a new state. And I could tell you a little bit more if you have questions about that experience.
yeah. Okay. So I'm hearing you talk about just first of all this sense of a need for a change, right? So
Mm-hmm.
this kind of restlessness, which a lot of people, when I've spoken to them about going into a new space or moving, it's
Mm-hmm.
often God uses this discomfort, this restlessness, this
Mm-hmm.
unsettling feeling. Sometimes also God closes doors. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and you just get the sense that he's asking you to do something different. I think about before I did the move that I did, it was just everything that was in life at the time just started to not feel like it was meeting the mark. It felt like everything was coming to a close. It
Mm-hmm.
felt like it was the right time to end home education for our daughter. It felt like I was questioning what I was going to do with my career, and I'd worked really hard, but it wasn't really. So, yeah, the same sort of
Mm-hmm.
restlessness. And then you've got here this dream, which actually
Mm-hmm.
confirms.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's interesting. I mean, I don't know what you do when you think, okay, I think God's spoken, and then you don't like it. It's like, ugh. Um, but yeah, it's really interesting that that restlessness is often
Mm-hmm.
something. that comes about. So you talked about you did a pre-visit.
I did a pre-visit the year before I actually moved.
Mm,
Yes.
and you
Yeah.
didn't like it. It was,
I wasn't really in love with it initially. No. And I remember asking God, I was like, God, can I go to Virginia? Because Virginia was where my school was. I was actually in grad school at the time that I was planning this move. And I was like, can I move to Virginia? Because I think, when you're not sure if it's God, I think sometimes we look for things that feels familiar.
mm,
And for me, because I've been to Virginia for like when they would have intensives, I was like, oh, this feels good. I could get used to here. So, but he just kept North Carolina really heavy on my heart. And um yeah, it yeah, yeah.
mm. So knew it was time for a change, but
Yes.
actually taking that first step is a whole different story, right? So what was the
Mm-hmm.
moment that you realized, okay, God, I'm doing this?
I think it was after the dream. It was after the dream. I was like, I've been hearing it. I've asked him for a confirmation. Um, the dream happened eventually, I think maybe 5 months before I actually moved.
Mm,
um and I was like, okay, I'm just gonna move forward with that. My sister, thankfully, you need encouraging friends and folks to
mm,
remind you along the way, and she kept on me. She was like, come on, we gotta look for apartments, we gotta do this, we gotta do that. So she kept me motivated because she was excited for me. So I think it was, if I didn't have her support, I would probably still be kind of like lackadaisical a little bit.
That's interesting. So I was going to ask you about, when you
Hmm.
made the announcement you were doing this move, what were the people around you? How was their response? Because
Well,
sometimes when we're called to step into something, not
yeah,
everyone around us gets it, right? Not everyone understands it.
no, not everyone did, because get this, I was in grad school and I was leaving a full-time position with benefits.
Mm,
I had no job lined up in North Carolina when I left. I just knew God told me to go,
mm,
and I was going. And so I remember one girl at the job that I used to work for, she worked in a different department. She was freaking out. She was like, you have no job? Oh my gosh, I need to look for benefits, and do you have food stamps? And, like, I'm like,
yeah,
no, I'm good. I'm good. God got me. She was freaking out. And some people were excited about it, and some people thought I was crazy because, again, I was moving without any job and not knowing a lot of people. But we'll talk about the wells in a second.
yeah. But it's really interesting, right? Because it's that thing about you can sometimes look really crazy when
Mm-hmm.
you're talking about the wilderness because wisdom
Mm-hmm.
says you don't
Everything
do
got to be
that.
lined up.
You
Mm-hmm.
don't do that. You don't quit a stable
Mm-hmm.
setting to go into this this vacuum, I guess, not really knowing how things are
Mm-hmm.
gonna fall because you think you had a dream. Oh,
Mm.
most people would be like, that's
Right.
crazy. How did you manage? Did you have any uncertainties? How did you manage? Were you always very clear that no, this is what God is telling me to do? Or did you have any points that you wavered?
Absolutely. I think in the beginning, because again, it's scary, right? Like, I've never been outside of the comforts of my parent, even though I was 30 something years old. I think I was probably 30-ish, or maybe 32-ish. And it was scary. Even when I got there, the fear didn't leave. I think I would wake up because I tried everything when I first moved to North Carolina to find a job. I wasn't getting anything. I dumped my resume down. At the time, I had a bachelor's degree. I thought for sure I could get something, with this. I even applied to department stores. Nobody was hiring. So I spent about 5 months unemployed, and but I could literally hear God telling me, rest, relax. I think he was trying to break me out of this, if you live in New York, it's a go, go, grind type of environment. So I think he was trying to break that, make me off of that pattern, to to trust. But I would wake up most mornings very anxious because, of course, financial concerns was, a huge thing for me. And I had a whole apartment for the first time in my life. I have utilities now,
Yeah.
have a car note. So, yeah, I remember many mornings waking up feeling anxious, but I still had peace, because I think a part of the excitement for me was, who was I going to meet while I'm here, the different connections I would make,
Mm.
what life would be like in this new environment.
It's really interesting because I think you make a really valid point because we are talking about the pioneer wilderness.
Mm-hmm.
And, we've kind of talked about, the decision. There's that wilderness of you making the decision to actually do it, that wilderness of when people don't understand um, what why you're doing what you're doing. You can feel quite alone and unsure. But then you actually make the move, and there's still that wilderness where things you're waiting for things to come together, right? So,
Yeah.
you've done it by choice, and it feels like it would be so much easier if you land in North Carolina and you suddenly discover that God's got everything lined up exactly the way that you expected, and you walk into your dream job and you're like, yep, this was totally worth it. But as you said, that's not the experience you had. There was still that wilderness of having to trust that God, that you've made the right decision because not everything's falling into place. So,
Yeah.
how has that experience shaped your faith? Has it had an
Um,
impact?
yes. I think, okay, so there were different encounters that I had while living in North Carolina, more so on a financial end. I think I remember telling God one day, like, financially, which is so weird to say, but I think a lot of us may struggle with it. Like, financially, I was telling God, like, I don't trust you in this area. Like, I'm noticing, like, I don't trust you to take care of me in this area for some reason. And I feel like he took me through a process to kind of break that fear of lack off of me, because what eventually happened was um I after I graduated grad school, took a job, left my part-time job, took this job because I was promised full-time work, and it ended up not being that. And so for 3 months I worked with this company, and I prayed to God. I really prayed to leave because I knew God had sent me there, not the wilderness. I knew God had sent me there. When I got to the interview, I just felt God's peace, and I knew I was going to get the position. And and so I took the job, and I hated it. But I knew I could not leave because God sent me there, so I had to wait. And I think I was there for maybe 3 or 4 months. And then they terminated me from the position on the day that I asked God, if you want me to stay, I'll stay. But if you want me to leave, please make a way. So on that same day, I got let go. And that would leave me out of work for another 4 to 5 months. And this position that had terminated me, they weren't paying me on time. So I was in a situation where I had no cushion money. And they, my first time ever with my phone being cut off, first time ever being almost evicted from my home. And during the time that I was not working, though, and if we're talking about the wells, I don't know
Mm.
if I'm moving ahead of the conversation.
Okay, good.
Okay. So during this time, I felt like God took care of me the best that I've ever experienced, right? I remember just having favor in so many different areas. He told me to go to my church, who ended up paying like 3 months of my rent at the time, my car notes, my utilities. Like they just covered everything. People were blessing me. People were putting money in my hands.
Mm.
I still have a check that, well, I got a check or money in the mail, and I still don't know who sent it.
Wow.
Right. And so it was just a beautiful experience for God to just show me, like, I am your source.
Mm.
And it really, I think from that day, I don't worry about money, or from that experience, I don't worry about my bank account being at a certain level like I
Mm-hmm.
used to before. I remember thinking in therapy, there's a modality called, um, uh, man, the name is slipping me right now, but it's pretty much, it's probably, well, one of the terms is exposure therapy, but I think it's called systematic desensitization.
Mm-hmm.
And what it does is, um the therapist will slowly introduce the client to the thing that they have phobias around,
Right.
until they could fully tolerate it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think God did that with me. He gave me little scared until I could tolerate, what I was experiencing and breaking the anxiety of it. So it was just really, really an amazing experience. I remember just crying my eyes out when my church came back and told me they're going to cover, 2 months of my rent. And initially they covered the first month, and then I went back. The Lord was like, go back. And when I went back, they decided to cover 2 more months. So it was just a beautiful experience.
Yeah, I really love what you've shared because I think you're kind of bringing us nicely around to what the purpose of a lot of these wildernesses are. Very
Mm,
often in the wilderness, if you're brave, you do ask those questions where you start to realize, oh, Lord, I'm realizing I don't trust you here. I
mm,
don't trust you in this. And it can be a real situation where you get to see where you're really at in your faith
mhm,
walk in certain areas. But it also reminds us what the wilderness is about, because sometimes we can feel that the wilderness is just about God wanting to give us some hardship. Some people even can start to believe that the wilderness is a punishment of some sort. But
mhm, mhm,
actually, the example you've given, God was used that wilderness to transform your faith in the area with him and to teach you a lesson that you
mhm.
would be able to carry for the rest of your life, that you would
Yes.
forever relate to him differently in that area
Yeah.
of provision. And I think it's really important for us to remember that, because when you're in the middle of the wilderness, you're not always aware of the growth that's happening, and you're not always aware of the lessons and the transformation that God is doing in your
Mhm,
life. But it's really important that we do take time to pause and look back, because some of our deepest truths that we hold about God have been grown in those wilderness areas.
yeah.
Um, and they're reference points. They become reference points that you can go back to, that when you're facing challenges in the future, he gives you those testimonies, right? That you can remember and recall where he's come through again. But yeah, it's the wilderness is often uncomfortable, and it can be uncomfortable not just because of the circumstances, but sometimes we're confronted with where we're really at,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
in itself, I believe that's part of the reason. It's an invitation for us to engage with God in that area. But
Mm,
sometimes, I know definitely for me, I felt really sure that I trusted God in certain areas. And definitely in this most recent wilderness of moving, I had to confront, yeah, I don't really trust him in that area. Just straight up, I don't.
mhm,
But likewise, he has
mhm,
come through in those areas that it's transformed my perception in areas I didn't even know I
mhm,
had a problem. I thought I was fine.
mm,
So it's one thing
mhm.
to say it, it's another thing to live it, right? So
Yes, ma'am.
we can say,
Yeah.
I trust God. And it's not until you're in the situation where you really have to trust him,
Yeah.
that's when you really find out where your trust levels are. Um,
Yeah.
and I
And
think, go ahead.
no, no. You can go ahead and finish it. I'll
No,
say mine.
I just think that's the purpose of the wilderness, and that's why we go into various um wilderness processes. I always like the saying that God's more interested in the journey than the destination.
Mm-hmm.
He's more interested in the transformation that happens along the way. And we can forget as Christians that that's what this is all about, that we're journeying through life. and
Mm-hmm.
he is transforming us from glory to glory to
Mm-hmm.
more and more to look like him and to be like him. And
Mm-hmm.
wildernesses are great opportunities for those
Yeah.
transformations to happen in.
Yeah. I think, as you're speaking, I'm thinking this morning. So right now I'm in another wilderness experience. And so I'm trying to look at all of the different stories around the wilderness. And
Mm-hmm.
one of them that I looked at this morning was the story of Hagar. And what you were saying, you know, her encounter with God in the wilderness, um, it, it she was the first person to name God, the God who sees me, El Roi. And I think sometimes when we're going through the wilderness is for us to get to know God in a more personal level. On a more personal level, you look at Moses. Moses had the encounter with the burning bush, where God spoke to him as well. So I just love that from her experience of where she was being ill treated by her, mistress or whatever you would call them back in the day, and probably feeling it just gave me such a maybe a sense of how she might have been feeling. And now here is God presenting himself, her being a servant, being a maid, being I don't know what they would call a woman that has a child for another man that work, you know what I mean, the whole thing. But for her to say, oh my gosh, God sees me, this is the God who sees me. And I think a part of a part of the wilderness is for us to really have, those moments where we may doubt, to really have that encounter and that knowing of who God is in these spaces. For me, it was God is my source. And for you, what would you say it was for you?
Think it was the same lesson that God was my source. Because I did a
Mm-hmm.
similar move, right? I was at a
Mm-hmm.
well-paid job and quit it to come here with nothing in place, and
Mm-hmm.
still marvel that for a whole year we still managed to eat, and I'm not quite sure how.
Mm-hmm.
I have always had a job, so to be without a job for a year
Mm-hmm.
was daunting. When you talk about those mornings of anxiety, yep, absolutely
Mm-hmm.
experienced all of that. But yeah, people coming and giving money, just
Mm-hmm.
all of those amazing things. And as I said, yeah, it was a great reminder that God is my source,
Yeah.
and putting the job and all the other things into perspective,
Mm-hmm.
um, to realize that that may be the tool he uses, but ultimately that's I don't have to be dependent on that,
Mm-hmm.
because when he needs to get the funds to me, he can and he will.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And even as I'm in this new season, this new wilderness season, it's almost like he's prepping me um with Matthew chapter 6,
Mm,
a very familiar chapter that talks about not to worry about what you're going to eat or what you're going to drink, take no thought for tomorrow and so forth. And earlier on in that chapter, it speaks about like your where your treasure is, there will your heart lie, or something
yeah.
like that. And it's almost like, there's a shift that he is attempting to do again in the area of finances. And it makes sense because he says you cannot serve me and serve money at the same
Mm,
time. And so seek me first and everything will fall into place. Do what it is that I'm asking you to do, and provision, trust me, provision will come. Just focus on stuff. And for me, I feel like I don't know why he's hitting me with that right now. In this new wilderness, I'm in the beginning phases of it. Um, and it's almost like he's prepping me, like, don't worry about money. Just focus on, give attention to what I'm asking you to do and what I'm telling you to do. And, your provisions, your needs, it goes into, and it's funny because I always use journals that speak to me, that has something on there. And it actually has consider the lilies, how they grow.
mm,
And, it's like they don't have to work or toil. They're just taken care of. And I think it's around that idea, like Konje, Celeste, whoever's listening, like he will take care of you.
Yeah.
Just take care of the things that he's asking you to do, taking things one day at a time. Don't look too far ahead. I love Matthew 6:34 in the message version. It just drives it home, you know. So yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Um, yeah. It's I love, as I said, I love what you've shared, it is that journey. I just wanted to pull up that scripture that you mentioned.
Yes, Matthew 6:34 in the
Matthew
message.
6:34 in the message. Let's have a look. So it says, give your entire attention to what God is doing right now and don't get worked up about what may or may not happen tomorrow. God will help you deal with whatever hard times come up when the time comes. That's beautiful. And I think,
Mm-hmm.
it's a question that I've been kind of thinking as I've entered this new way of life and just wondering, as it's felt like sometimes I'm a planner, so I like to plan.
Yes, ma'am.
And it has felt like a wilderness not having a plan, but
Mm-hmm.
having to trust that God's going to provide what needs to be provided or give me the information of what's needed at the time that I need it. And I
Mm-hmm.
do remember early on thinking, but what if actually this is how the Christian life is meant to be?
Mm-hmm.
That we
Mm-hmm.
are supposed to be that flexible and that in tune that we are just literally waiting for his guidance to move
Mm-hmm.
and go in
Mm-hmm.
whichever way that he wants us to go. And so it's really interesting when it says, not to really be worrying or giving to give your entire attention to what he's doing now, and
Mm-hmm.
to really trust that he's going to help you to deal with whatever's to come.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's not about worrying about tomorrow because it's knowing that he's got tomorrow.
Right.
Um, and that speaks of a real level of trust in God that whatever's coming tomorrow, you feel assured that he's got you.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah. And the assurance, like he's telling you, like in that scripture as well from this message version, is that I'll give you what you need as the hard things come up. Like literally, I got you. Just focus on today, get through today. Tomorrow is another day. There's another, I like to look at different translations as well. And I'm trying to see there, I feel like there was one that says like I'm already like in tomorrow. I'm already there.
yeah, what you're saying is
Yeah.
encouraging me even now for the week I
Mm.
have ahead.
Mm.
Just yeah, that reminder that he's already got it tomorrow, and no
Yeah.
matter what you're gonna face, he will give you what you need on time. You may not feel like you have it now, but you rest assured that at the
Yes.
time you need it, he will give that to you.
Yes.
You
So
know,
it really it even drives home the whole idea of this the lily, right?
Mm,
And how it doesn't have to do anything,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So I think he is, and we know one of our favorite scriptures is the sorry, one of our favorite scriptures, Matthew 11,
Mm.
28 through 30, which you referenced in one of your previous podcasts. Learning the is it the
Unforced
unforced
rhythms of
rhythms
grace.
of
Yeah.
grace, and I think he is really trying to drive that home
Mm.
to us of the fact that we don't have to toil, we don't have to work, just
Mhm.
rest, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah. And as you said in my previous podcast, I've talked about our struggle with rest, that we've been trained to
Mm,
think that we have to toil.
mm-hmm,
Um, but so much of what God has been showing me definitely has been, it's really not, but I couldn't toil to the level I needed to toil anyway.
mm-hmm,
It really is
mm-hmm,
about resting and knowing that all the strength sits with Him, all the
mm-hmm,
ability sits with Him. And I've just got to ride on those graces,
mm-hmm,
those rhythms of grace, um, and stop trying to use my effort to
mm-hmm.
get through. So we like to say on this podcast that in every wilderness there is a well.
Yes.
So we talked about the hardship. We talked about the great, it's great transformation. At the end of it all, we can, kind of say, oh, look, this is how God grew me. And
Mm-hmm.
this is, but we know going through that season is real hard. There are
Mm-hmm.
points that
Mm-hmm.
you want to give up.
Yes.
There are points where you feel like you've got it wrong. There are points where you may even wonder, does God love me if I'm having to go
Yeah.
through this?
Yeah.
So you mentioned before a little bit about a well. What were some of the wells that you noticed in your wilderness?
Um, yes, I do want to just validate what you said too in terms of um just the crying out to God, the lack of faith, the anger. Um, and then I'll touch on the wells because I remember one day I thought that after I completed school that monies will not be an issue, like I will not have any financial struggles. So to be losing a job and not getting any employment after, it was hard. And I remember one day not having any money when I went to church. I remember going to church and my friend put $200 in my hand. And I remember leaving church and being angry at God. I was like, why is it that, somebody has to be giving me money? Like,
Mm,
and all of that, all of those stuff had to come out and out, up and out, but it could be, like you said, a scary experience in the beginning, but I mean, that was one of my wells. My community, my church, like I said, they came through for me in so many ways. My parents also came through for me during that season. I remember one day calling my dad. I'm like, Daddy, I don't have rent this month. And he didn't ask any questions. He just said, how much you need? And that was it. And I was so nervous. And it was humbling experience too, because I did not want to have to ask my parents for anything. I did not want to have to go to a church and ask for anything.
mm,
So I think it was also God humbling me at the same time. Because I remember the second time that I had to go to the church, I felt so embarrassed and I was like, God, you know, I don't like this. And he said, don't don't see them, see me.
mm,
See that you're asking me and not them. And that was the time I remember I explained to the pastor who was over that ministry at the time. And I explained to him like what God had been sharing with me during this time. And I remember at the end of the conversation, he said, I'm going in there and I'm going to fight for you. And for me, it was like God saying, I'm going to fight for you. And he came back with 2 more months rent, 2 more months utilities, my car notes, everything. So yeah, my church was a huge well. I would say my personal relationship with God as well acted as a well.
yeah.
Um, because you when you're in that position, you you have no choice but to depend because I had no income, nothing, nada,
Mm,
zip, zilch. And because I wasn't getting paid from the previous job, I was already in a deficit.
yeah.
So I had nothing. So I literally, and it's so crazy because during that time, I was the most generous I've ever been, even in my
Interesting.
moments of lack. Yeah, it was so weird. I guess because um I I ain't had any much, but I was still like giving,
Mm,
because I think God helped me get to that point of not worrying about what I had or what I didn't have. And I found myself just being so extra generous, so not concerned. I don't know if I'm going through this cycle again to
mm,
kind of bring me back to that place. Because it's just something when you start bringing in an income again, you just start getting super conscious.
yeah, very true. Which sounds like a contradiction, right? But
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah, but so true. So you had some good wells in there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I want you to talk to someone who's listening, so who might right now feel like God's calling them to step into something new, but they're scared.
Mm.
What would you say to them?
I would say Um, if you know it's God, trust him. I would say if you know it's God, follow him. It's an adventure. See it as an adventure. Like I said, I'm in my second um wilderness where I'm at the beginning phases of it. Um, I have now decided, which is something that I felt like was telling me a couple of years ago to try to launch out and do my own practice. So I'm now in that space and I don't know what to expect. Everything is day by day. And so trust him. I think it may feel scary, but I think it's also a great opportunity if there's something that you've been praying for and asking God for in terms of maybe your relationship with him or just something that you desire to see for yourself. I think it's a great opportunity to just experience God in a new way. It's a great opportunity for him to even um, just invite you to that rest that we've been talking about. The fact that you
Yeah.
don't have to do things in your own strength, the fact that you're taking him day by day, doing what he says day by day gives you an opportunity and a different way of living that feels more abundant and more free. And so I don't know where this journey is going to take me. And I don't know where his journey is going to take you, but we just know that, you know, um, his plans are to prosper us and not to harm us, to give us a future and an expected end. And even though things might feel difficult, I always remember that it says it's not to harm,
Mm.
according to what it says in Jeremiah, it's not to harm you. So just remember that wherever you are and whatever it is that you might be experiencing right now.
It's beautiful. Well, this has been a really wonderful conversation. And before we close, how can our listeners connect with you and learn more about what you're doing?
Yes. So right now I am like I said not too long ago, I'm in the process of starting my own practice, but you can find me online on Instagram. I have a parenting coaching business right now, Safe Space Parenting on Instagram, and I believe also on TikTok, but mostly on Instagram. And my website is a safe space for you.com. And yeah, more information. You should be able to get more information from there. And I look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks so much, Konje. If today's episode spoke to you, I'd love to hear from you. Send me a message, leave a review, or share this with someone who needs encouragement in their wilderness season. And remember, when God calls you into the unknown, He always provides wells in the wilderness. Let's find them together.